Have you ever wondered who the Antichrist really is? We've all heard the stories, right? The terrifying figure from the book of Revelation, the one with the number 666, rising up from the sea, leading the world astray, and waging war against God's people. The Antichrist is one of the most famous and mysterious figures in the Bible, and for centuries, people have tried to figure out who exactly this man might be. Now, what if I told you that this figure, this person we've all been warned about, might not be some distant future villain, but someone who lived nearly 2,000 years ago? What if the Antichrist was a man who ruled a mighty empire, left a legacy of destruction, and had a reputation so dark that even after his death, people still feared his return? This man's name was Nero. And for many early Christians, he was the embodiment of evil. Nero, the emperor of Rome, went from being adored by his people to becoming one of the most despised tyrants in history. His reign was filled with cruelty, madness, and violence, and many even believed that Nero was the Antichrist himself. But what made people think that? How did a ruler, once loved by the masses, become the symbol of evil and the inspiration for one of the most chilling prophecies in the Bible? In the next few minutes, we're going to dive into the life of Nero, explore why early Christians believed he was the Antichrist, and look at how his reign fulfilled some of the darkest prophecies in the Bible. Nero's actions were so horrific, so destructive, that they not only marked his time, but continue to echo through history. And as we dig deeper into his life, we'll see how his story aligns with the imagery from the book of Revelation. So, get ready. This journey is not just about ancient history, it's about uncovering a mystery that has captivated people for centuries. Is Nero really the Antichrist? Let's find out together. Stay with me as we unpack the chilling story of Nero and his connection to one of the most infamous figures in all of Scripture. Have you ever felt that unsettling feeling when reading the book of Revelation? The vivid imagery, the mysterious symbols, the prophecies of an ultimate battle between good and evil, it can all feel a little overwhelming, can't it? But within these pages, there is one figure that stands out, casting a shadow over everything else, the Antichrist. The prophecy describes a man who rises from the sea, a beast with 7 heads and 10 horns, wearing crowns and blasphemous names. This figure is destined to bring destruction, deceive the masses, and wage war against God's people in the final days. Now, we all know about 666, the number associated with the Antichrist. It's become a symbol of evil, used in countless movies, books, and even in everyday conversation. We've all heard the chilling stories about this number, but what does it really mean? What does it represent in the context of Revelation, and how does it connect to the figure who will rise in the last days? In Revelation 13, the Apostle John writes, "Let him that hath understanding count the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666." This prophecy speaks to us about more than just a number. It's a symbol of a person, a ruler, a power that will come to dominate the world. But this figure isn't just some distant prophecy about a far-off time. For the early Christians, this wasn't just some vague figure they read about in a book. This was a very real threat that they believed was already in their midst. They didn't need to look into the distant future. They looked to their present day, to the empire they lived under, to a ruler they feared deeply. And that ruler was Nero. To the early Christians, Nero wasn't just a tyrant. He was the embodiment of everything the Antichrist represented. His reign was marked by cruelty, violence, and a complete disregard for the lives of his people, especially the Christians he persecuted. When John wrote the book of Revelation, many believed he was describing Nero and the terrifying power he wielded. But how did Nero fit the description in Revelation? How did a man who began his reign with promises of peace and prosperity turn into a figure of such evil and fear? What was it about him that led so many to believe that he was the very person the Bible warned about? As we dive deeper into this story, we'll see how Nero's actions lined up with the prophetic words in Revelation. We'll explore how the early Christians saw him as the Antichrist and why, even after his death, they feared his return. The prophecy of the Antichrist wasn't just a story for them, it was a warning they saw playing out in real time in the reign of one of the most despised emperors in history. So, let's move forward together and explore how Nero became the personification of the Antichrist in the minds of early Christians. Let's see how his rule fits the terrifying prophecies of Revelation and why his name is still associated with evil to this very day. When Nero first came to power, he was just a teenager, only 16 years old. Now, imagine that for a moment. A young boy, barely out of adolescence, suddenly becomes the most powerful man in the world. At first, things looked promising. The Senate, the people, they all loved him. Nero was charming, ambitious, and seemed to have a genuine desire to restore the greatness of Rome. In the early days, he made bold promises, saying he would bring peace, lower taxes, and improve the lives of the common people. He even promised to restore the authority of the Senate, which, as you can imagine, was a move that won him many supporters. His reign began with celebrations, and many thought he would be a wise and just ruler. For a while, it seemed like he was living up to the promise. He passed laws that helped the poor, held grand festivals, and appeared to be a ruler who cared about the welfare of his people. But as we all know, appearances can be deceiving. Over time, Nero's true nature began to reveal itself, and it was far darker than anyone had anticipated. The charm and promises slowly faded away, and what emerged was a ruler who was increasingly erratic and power-hungry. Nero's love for the arts was no secret. In fact, he was obsessed with music, theater, and performances. He traveled the empire, holding concerts, performing on stage, and demanding applause from his people. But here's the problem: he wasn't very good at it. His voice was weak and off-key, and yet he expected his subjects to applaud him for his talent. Can you imagine that? A ruler who forced his people to attend his performances and even executed those who dared to leave early. It's almost comical when you think about it, but it reveals a lot about Nero's mindset. You see, for Nero, it wasn't about ruling wisely or justly, it was about being adored. He wanted to be loved not just as a ruler, but as an artist, a performer, a celebrity. But the people weren't blind. They began to grow weary of his antics, and what was once admiration slowly turned to resentment. His need for validation led him to cruel extremes. And soon, the promises of peace and prosperity began to crumble. Nero's reign, which started with such potential, began to spiral out of control. His mother, Agrippina, who had played a huge role in securing his throne, found herself at odds with him. She had raised him, put him on the throne, and fought to keep him there, but now she was meddling in his rule, trying to hold on to some power of her own. And Nero, in his arrogance, decided that he had to get rid of her. So, he did what any power-hungry emperor would do. He murdered her. The cruelty didn't stop there. Nero's lust for power led him to eliminate anyone who stood in his way. He killed his own wife, Claudia Octavia, accusing her of being infertile and banishing her to an island where she was eventually executed. His cruelty was no longer hidden behind the mask of a benevolent ruler. It was now out in the open, and the people began to see him for what he truly was, a tyrant. As we move forward, we see how this false start, this brief moment of glory, quickly gave way to a reign marked by bloodshed, fear, and ultimately betrayal. Nero's story didn't end with a peaceful reign or a prosperous empire. Instead, it turned into a nightmare, one that would haunt not just Rome, but the early Christian community as well. Nero's true nature, the monster he had become, would soon make him the perfect candidate for the title of Antichrist. And as his reign grew darker, so did his connection to the prophecy in Revelation. But before we dive deeper into his descent into madness, let's pause and reflect on how the promise of greatness can often be overshadowed by the pursuit of power. Just like Nero, many of us start with good intentions, but without humility and a genuine heart for the people we lead, we can easily be consumed by our own pride and ambition. And it's this lesson, this warning, that we must all take to heart as we continue with the story of Nero. So, let's explore how his reign took a turn for the worse and how Nero's downfall would shape the legacy of the Antichrist. As Nero's reign continued, the glittering promises of his early days began to fade, revealing the darkness lurking beneath the surface. The traits that had once made him a seemingly charming young ruler, his desire for popularity, his obsession with entertainment, soon transformed into something far more dangerous. His quest for power, fame, and control took a sinister turn, and the very qualities that had made him beloved by the people now became the tools of a tyrant. Nero's thirst for approval from the public soon escalated into a hunger for complete domination. He wanted more than to be a ruler. He wanted to be worshipped. He wasn't content with being admired from afar. He demanded the spotlight. And in his mind, if the people weren't willing to give it to him freely, he would force them to do so. As his actions grew more erratic, Nero became increasingly detached from the reality of his empire's needs. The lavish performances he had once put on to entertain the masses now became a symbol of his utter disregard for the suffering of his people. Nero demanded that everyone, from the common citizens to the senators, attend his performances, and any who dared to leave before the show was over faced the harshest of punishments, often death. Can you imagine being forced to sit through a performance for hours, knowing you could lose your life for walking out? Nero's obsession with music, acting, and poetry became a metaphor for his rule. It was all about him. He even had special soldiers to clap and cheer for him, forcing the people to express admiration for his talent that many believed to be embarrassingly poor. It wasn't long before the people of Rome started to grow weary of him. And when the people grow weary, a tyrant begins to lose control. But it didn't stop there. Nero's bloodlust grew. His need for power and control didn't just stop at forcing applause or locking people into theaters, it turned to murder. In a shocking display of cruelty, Nero had his own mother, Agrippina, killed. The woman who had fought tooth and nail to put him on the throne, the woman who had raised him, was no longer useful to him, so he plotted her death. At first he tried poisoning her, but when that failed, he resorted to more drastic measures, even attempting to have a ceiling collapse on her. When that didn't work, he finally sent assassins to end her life. The murder of his mother wasn't an isolated incident. Nero had no qualms about eliminating anyone who stood in his way, including his wife, Claudia Octavia. He accused her of infertility, exiled her, and eventually had her executed, simply because she was no longer of use to him. And so we begin to see the true face of Nero, a ruler who had no regard for human life, a ruler who would kill anyone, even family, to hold on to his power. Nero's descent into tyranny wasn't just marked by cruelty toward those around him, but also by his blatant defiance of God. He set himself up as a god, demanding worship from his people and using his position to indulge his every desire, no matter how depraved. His actions were no longer just about maintaining control, they were about asserting his divinity. He wanted to be seen as more than just an emperor. He wanted to be seen as an all-powerful being above reproach. This is where the connection to the Antichrist becomes clear. The Antichrist, as prophesied in the book of Revelation, is someone who exalts himself above all that is called God, who seeks to be worshipped and adored as a false god. And Nero, in his quest for ultimate power, began to embody this very spirit. But his reign of terror didn't stop with his immediate family. Nero turned his wrath on the Christians. He blamed them for the great fire of Rome, using them as scapegoats for the disaster that had destroyed much of the city. And with that, he began a campaign of brutality, rounding up Christians and torturing them in the most horrific ways. Some were torn apart by wild animals, while others were crucified or set on fire, used as human torches to light his gardens at night. This wasn't just persecution, it was a declaration of war against God's people. Nero's cruelty and his thirst for power reached unprecedented heights, and in doing so, he became the very image of the Antichrist. His actions, his words, and his mindset all pointed to a man who was willing to destroy anyone and anything in his path to keep his power and worship. Nero had truly descended into tyranny. He wasn't just a bad ruler, he was a force of evil, and the early Christians saw him as the fulfillment of the prophecy in Revelation. His reign of terror had become the reality that they feared, and they lived in constant threat of his wrath. But his cruelty would not last forever. Even tyrants fall. And as we move forward, we'll see how Nero's reign came to an end and how his name continued to haunt the Christian faith long after his death. But before we move on, let's pause and reflect on how easily a ruler can be corrupted by power and how the pursuit of glory can often lead us down a path of destruction. Nero's rise to power may have started with promises of peace and prosperity, but it quickly spiraled into a nightmare. His story is a warning to us all. When we seek power for the wrong reasons, we risk becoming the very thing we fear the most. As Nero's reign spiraled deeper into tyranny, his cruelty took on a darker form. The seeds of hatred he had sowed against those who crossed him began to grow, and this time the target wasn't just political enemies or rivals. This time Nero turned his sights on the followers of Christ, the Christians. You see, in 64 AD, a catastrophic event shook the city of Rome. A fire broke out and raged for 6 days, leaving much of the city in ruins. It was a tragedy that sent shockwaves through the empire. But instead of taking responsibility for his failure to control the fire, Nero looked for someone to blame. And who did he choose? The Christians. It's important to understand why. In Nero's eyes, these new followers of Jesus were a threat. Their refusal to worship the Roman gods and their rejection of the emperor's divinity made them seem like enemies of the state. They were outsiders, their beliefs strange and foreign to the traditions of Rome. And so, in a moment of desperation and in an effort to deflect the blame, Nero found a perfect scapegoat in these faithful people. What followed was one of the most brutal and infamous periods of persecution in history. Nero didn't just arrest and imprison Christians. He made their suffering a public spectacle. He ordered them to be dragged into the arenas where they were savagely torn apart by wild animals. Some were crucified, others burned alive. It said that Nero even used Christians as human torches, tying them to posts in his garden and setting them on fire to light the night as he entertained his guests. The persecution was relentless and horrifying. But it wasn't just physical suffering that the Christians endured. They were subjected to the deepest psychological torment as well. They were accused of being traitors to the Roman Empire, falsely charged with starting the fire that devastated the city. Many were forced to deny their faith, to renounce Christ, and to worship Nero as a god. But most of them refused. These early Christians, who had never known a world where their faith wasn't a radical stand against the culture, knew that to deny Christ was to betray the very core of their beliefs. So, they stood firm, even in the face of unimaginable pain and death. And in doing so, they became the first martyrs of the Christian faith. Their courage in the face of persecution would inspire generations to come. But what's striking, as we look back at this dark chapter in history, is the contrast between Nero and the Christians he persecuted. Nero, the man who sought power and glory through cruelty and violence, could not understand the strength of the Christians' faith. He tried to break them, to destroy them, but instead, their steadfastness in the face of suffering became a testimony that would echo through the ages. The early Christians were not just victims, they were witnesses to the power of God in the darkest of times. And their courage in the face of Nero's evil is something we can learn from today. When Nero unleashed his fury upon the Christians, he thought he could destroy their movement, but instead, he only strengthened it. The blood of the martyrs became the seed of the church. As we reflect on these first martyrs, we should remember that their courage didn't come from themselves. It came from their faith in Christ, the same faith that enables us to face trials and hardships in our own lives. But Nero's persecution of Christians wasn't just about the physical suffering he inflicted on them. It was about trying to break their spirits, trying to crush the very foundation of their faith. Yet despite everything Nero threw at them, the Christians emerged stronger, their faith more resolute. And it's this very spirit of defiance against evil, this steadfastness in the face of persecution, that made them the true victors. So, as we move forward in this story, let's pause for a moment and think about how we too can stand firm in our faith, no matter what challenges we face. Nero may have thought he could wipe out Christianity, but instead he only helped spread it farther and wider. As we'll see in the next chapter, Nero's reign would eventually crumble and the faith of the martyrs would continue to grow. But before we get to that, let's take a moment to reflect on the incredible power of the gospel that no tyrant, no ruler, no force of evil can ever stop. As the years passed, Nero's reign came to an end. The people of Rome, tired of his tyranny and cruelty, finally rose up against him. Nero, once the most powerful man in the world, found himself abandoned, betrayed by the very empire he had sought to control. In the summer of 68 AD, with no one left to defend him, Nero took his own life. It was a tragic, almost poetic end for a man who had once been revered and feared in equal measure. But his death didn't bring the peace the Romans had hoped for. In fact, it did the opposite. His death sparked something strange, something that would linger in the hearts and minds of people for years to come, the myth of Nero's return. You see, even though Nero was gone, his legacy of fear and power didn't die with him. People, especially in the East, began to believe that Nero wasn't really dead at all. They clung to the idea that he would come back, that somehow, in some way, Nero would return to seek vengeance. This belief in Nero's return was so strong that it became known as the Nero Redivivus myth, the idea that Nero was not gone forever, but merely biding his time, waiting for the right moment to rise again. Now, think about this for a second. How could this man, who had caused so much destruction and suffering, be so ingrained in the minds of the people? How could his death, which seemed to mark the end of a reign of terror, still leave such a powerful impression on the world? The fear of Nero was so profound that even after his death, people were convinced that he would rise again, like some kind of dark prophecy coming true. And it wasn't just a rumor. The myth of Nero's return wasn't just whispered in the corners of taverns and market stalls. It spread like wildfire, and before long there were impostors who appeared, claiming to be Nero himself. In the years following his death, there were at least 3 separate individuals who tried to take advantage of the Nero Redivivus myth, declaring themselves to be Nero resurrected. These men, with their similar appearance and mannerisms, gathered followers and attempted to raise armies to overthrow the current Roman leadership, hoping to take advantage of the lingering belief that Nero would one day return. In one of the most bizarre episodes, a man claiming to be Nero even tried to rally support in Greece, only to be caught and killed before he could make any real move. But the story didn't end there. Nero's shadow lingered on. The myth of his return wasn't just a passing fancy, it was a reflection of the trauma that Nero had caused. His reign had been so oppressive, so filled with terror, that the very thought of his return was enough to send shivers down the spines of the Romans. The people didn't just fear Nero as a ruler, they feared him as a force of evil, a presence so powerful that even his death didn't seem to break his hold on them. And there's something deeply spiritual about this myth. You see, for the early Christians, Nero wasn't just a bad emperor, he was the personification of evil. His cruelty and his willingness to destroy anyone in his path made him seem almost demonic. The idea that he could return from the dead to finish his reign of terror fit perfectly with the biblical prophecy of the Antichrist. And for those early Christians who had lived through his persecution, the myth of Nero's return wasn't just a tale, it was a terrifying possibility that haunted their minds. But as the myth of Nero's return spread, it revealed something important about the nature of evil and how it operates. Evil doesn't just disappear. It doesn't simply go away when we think it's over. Just like Nero's legacy, the forces of darkness can continue to haunt us long after the source of that evil is gone. This myth, this idea that Nero would return to finish what he started, reminds us that the battle between good and evil doesn't always have clear endings. Sometimes, the fear of evil's return can be just as powerful as the evil itself. Now, let's take a step back and reflect on what this myth means for us today. We live in a world where fear and doubt can sometimes feel as if they have the power to return, to re-enter our lives when we least expect it. Just like Nero's return, the challenges we face in life can sometimes feel like they're never truly gone, like they might come back and haunt us. But the truth of the gospel tells us something different. It tells us that even when the enemy seems to have the upper hand, even when the shadows of fear loom over us, God's victory is already assured. As we move forward, we'll explore how the myth of Nero's return fits into the larger picture of the Antichrist and how it points us toward a greater hope, the hope that evil will not have the final say. But before we dive into that, let's take a moment to reflect on how we can face the myths and fears in our own lives, trusting that God is in control, even when it feels like the darkness is rising again. Now, let's pause for a moment and think about the book of Revelation. It's a book that can feel overwhelming at times, isn't it? With its vivid images, cryptic prophecies, and symbols that seem to come alive on the page, it's easy to get lost in the details. But what if I told you that some of the most frightening images in Revelation weren't just about the distant future, but about what was happening right then in the very world the early Christians were living in? What if the prophecy John recorded had a more immediate meaning than we realized? In Revelation 13, we are introduced to a beast that rises from the sea. It's a terrifying image. 7 heads, 10 horns, and on its horns 10 crowns with blasphemous names written all over it. The beast is powerful, commanding the worship of the world. And as the chapter unfolds, we are told that the number of this beast is 666, a number that has haunted people for centuries, conjuring images of doom and destruction. But who is this beast? What does it represent? And why is the number 666 so significant? For the early Christians, this was not a vague prophecy about some far-off future. No, they believed they were living in the midst of it. The beast, with its 7 heads and 10 horns, was not some mystical, otherworldly creature. It was a symbol of the Roman Empire, with its many rulers, its vast power, and its relentless persecution of Christians. But what makes this beast even more frightening is that many early Christians saw it as a direct representation of Nero. Yes, the very same Nero we've been talking about, the emperor whose reign had been marked by brutality and evil. You see, the symbolism in Revelation was not just random. It had meaning for the people of that time. The 7 heads were believed to represent the 7 hills of Rome, the very city that was the heart of the empire. The 10 horns were seen as a symbol of the power and authority of Rome's leaders. And the blasphemous names on the beast? Well, Nero was infamous for declaring himself a god and demanding worship from his people. So, for the early Christians, the beast in Revelation was not just a prophecy of a future evil ruler, it was a direct reflection of the evil they were facing right then. But what about the number 666? Why is it so strongly connected to Nero? This is where things get really interesting. In the ancient world, numbers and letters were often connected, a practice known as Gematria. Each letter in the alphabet had a numerical value, and by adding up the values of the letters in a name, you could come up with a number. And when you take the name Nero Caesar and apply this system, the result is 666. That's right, the very number of the beast in Revelation corresponds to the name of Nero, the emperor who had tortured and murdered so many Christians. Now, this doesn't mean that Revelation was solely about Nero, but it does show how deeply the prophecy resonated with the early Christian community. They saw the beast as a symbol of Nero's reign and the evil that came with it. They saw Nero's persecution as the fulfillment of the prophecy John had written down. And this is why Nero was so often linked to the Antichrist figure in early Christian thought. He was the personification of the beast, the one who rose up with great power, demanded worship, and persecuted the saints. But it's not just the Christians of that time who saw these connections. The imagery in Revelation, the beast, and the number 666 continue to be interpreted today. Many still look to these prophecies as a warning about the future, about the rise of another Antichrist. But for the early Christians, it was a warning that was already in their midst. The evil they feared was not just something to come, it was something they were living through. The beast had already risen. The number 666 had already manifested in the form of Nero. So, what can we learn from this? Well, it's important to understand that evil doesn't always wait for the future to strike. Sometimes the darkness we fear is right in front of us, disguised in ways we don't always recognize. Nero's reign was a vivid example of this, a man who claimed to be a god, who demanded worship, and who brought suffering to those who opposed him, and yet, in the end, it was God who had the final say. Even though Nero's reign seemed to last forever, even though the fear of his return lingered for years, it was God who outlasted him. And that's a powerful lesson for us today. As we face the challenges and trials of our own time, it's easy to feel like evil is winning, that the forces of darkness are rising around us. But just as God was faithful in the time of Nero, so too will he be faithful in our time. The beast may rise, but it is God who will have the final victory. With that, let's continue on this journey together. In the next section, we'll explore how Nero's persecution of Christians not only fulfilled the prophecies of Revelation, but also shaped the future of the church and the faith of believers for centuries to come. Now, let's talk about one of the most infamous aspects of the Antichrist prophecy, the mark of the beast, and more specifically, the number 666. If you've ever read the book of Revelation, you've likely come across this number. It's a number that carries with it a sense of fear and mystery, something that has been etched into the public consciousness for centuries. But what does 666 really mean? And why is it so strongly connected to the figure of the Antichrist? When we think about the number 666, most of us picture it as a symbol of evil, right? It's been used in movies, books, and even pop culture as the number of the beast, the ultimate sign of the Antichrist's rule. But here's the thing. In the time the book of Revelation was written, the number 666 wasn't just some abstract, terrifying figure. It had a very specific meaning that early Christians would have immediately recognized. You see, in ancient times, numbers and letters were often intertwined. The letters of the alphabet weren't just letters, they were also numbers. This system, known as Gematria, was used to assign numerical values to words and names. And this is where the mystery of 666 begins to unfold. If you take the name Nero Caesar, the very name of the emperor who persecuted Christians with such brutality, and apply this Gematria system, you get the number 666. That's right, the very number that is associated with the beast, with the Antichrist, corresponds to the name of Nero. This isn't just coincidence, it's a powerful symbol. Early Christians who were living under the reign of Nero and experiencing the horrors of his rule would have immediately made the connection. The beast of Revelation wasn't some distant figure to them. It was Nero himself, the man whose cruelty seemed to embody everything that the prophecy warned about. Now, why is this so significant? Well, for the early Christians, this was a way of identifying the enemy. Nero wasn't just a ruler who had done bad things. He was the very embodiment of evil, the fulfillment of a prophecy that spoke of a leader who would rise to power, demand worship, and persecute the faithful. To them, 666 wasn't just a number, it was a marker, a sign that Nero was the beast. But the mystery doesn't end there. As we think about the mark of the beast, we often think about it in terms of a literal physical mark that people will have to take on their foreheads or hands in the future. We've seen this image portrayed in apocalyptic movies, where the mark becomes a symbol of control, of submission to the Antichrist. But in the case of Nero, the mark was much more subtle. It wasn't about a physical mark on the body, it was about the symbolism of his reign. It was about what Nero represented: a ruler who wanted to be worshipped, who demanded loyalty, who persecuted anyone who dared to stand in opposition to him. The mark of the beast wasn't just about a tattoo or a chip, it was about aligning yourself with evil, about choosing to live under the tyranny of someone who placed themselves above God. And here's the thing, the mark of the beast wasn't just a warning for the early Christians, it's a warning for us today too. It's a reminder that we are constantly faced with choices. We're faced with decisions about who we will follow, who we will serve, and what we will allow to have power over us. The mark of the beast is a symbol of allegiance, of submission to something that isn't of God. And as we reflect on Nero and the evil he represented, we're reminded of the importance of staying true to our faith and choosing to serve God no matter what the world may offer. But just as the early Christians found strength in their faith, so too can we find the courage to stand firm in the face of the challenges we face today. Nero may have had the power to kill, to destroy, to persecute, but he didn't have the power to break the spirit of those who chose to follow Christ. And in the same way, no matter what we face in our own lives, whether it's fear, temptation, or the pressures of the world, we can take heart in knowing that we don't have to bear the mark of the beast. We are marked by something greater. We are marked by the love and power of Christ. As we move forward, let's take a moment to reflect on what it means to choose whom we will serve. The choice between good and evil, between God's way and the world's way, is a decision we face every day. But just as the Christians stood firm in the face of Nero's persecution, we too can stand firm in our faith, knowing that the ultimate victory belongs to God. Nero's reign, once filled with promise and excitement, had long descended into chaos and terror. His quest for power, his obsession with being adored, and his complete disregard for the well-being of the Roman people all led him down a dark path. But as history often teaches us, no empire, no matter how mighty, can withstand tyranny forever. And by the year 68 AD, the once celebrated emperor found himself abandoned, surrounded by enemies, and betrayed by the very people who had once cheered for him. His empire, which he had tried so desperately to hold together through fear and manipulation, was now falling apart. The Senate, once loyal to him, turned their back. The provinces, sick of his cruelty and greed, began to rebel. Nero's grip on Rome slipped away faster than he could hold on to it. And so, in his final moments, Nero realized that his power had come to an end. Alone and desperate, with no one to support him, Nero did what so many tyrants do when they know they've lost. He took his own life. The man who once ruled the mightiest empire in the world ended his life in solitude, with only the echoes of his cruelty surrounding him. It was a sad and tragic end, but it also marked the end of an era of fear, oppression, and tyranny. Nero's death was not just the fall of one man, it was the collapse of an entire empire. Rome, the empire that had been his to command, was now left in turmoil. His death left a power vacuum, and what followed was a period of instability known as the Year of the Four Emperors, where several men vied for the throne, each hoping to restore order to the empire. But despite the chaos that followed, one thing was clear: Nero's reign had left a permanent scar on the Roman Empire. His legacy wasn't one of glory or greatness, it was one of destruction and fear. And even after his death, the image of Nero lived on. For many, he became the embodiment of evil, the very figure who represented the worst of humanity. The people of Rome, though they celebrated his death, couldn't escape the shadow he had cast. The myth of Nero's return, or Nero Redivivus, would continue to haunt the empire for years to come. Even after he was gone, the idea that he could rise again from the ashes of his destruction sent chills through the Roman world. The fear of his return, whether literal or symbolic, reminded the people that Nero's evil had never truly disappeared. And here's the sobering reality we must face. Tyranny and evil often leave behind a lingering impact. Even when the tyrant falls, the scars remain. The people of Rome had lived through the horrors of Nero's reign, and they couldn't simply erase the damage he had done. The effects of his cruelty echoed throughout the empire, just as the effects of evil actions can echo through generations. But there is hope. Even in the face of evil, even when it seems like all hope is lost, there is always the possibility of restoration and redemption. Nero's reign ended, and though the empire was shaken, it didn't collapse. The people of Rome and the early Christians who had suffered under his hand found strength in the belief that the true power of the empire, indeed the true power of life itself, was not in Nero, but in God. And while Nero's legacy of cruelty would remain, it was God who would have the final victory. Nero's end may have come as a result of his own choices, but God's kingdom cannot be shaken. As we reflect on Nero's life and the collapse of his empire, we are reminded that no matter how powerful the forces of evil may seem, they are temporary. The empire of God, however, stands forever. And with that truth in mind, we move forward, knowing that no matter what challenges or tribulations we face, God's kingdom will always endure. Now, let's take a look at how the collapse of Nero's reign and the fear that followed paved the way for the Christian faith to grow and flourish in ways Nero never could have imagined. As we look back on Nero's life, it's hard not to see the lasting impact of his reign. Nero is often remembered as the embodiment of evil. His cruelty, his self-worship, and his ruthless persecution of Christians left a dark stain on the Roman Empire. Even after his death, the echoes of his tyrannical rule haunted the empire. And for many early Christians, Nero became more than just a historical figure. He became the very symbol of the Antichrist. But why did Nero leave such a lasting legacy? Why did he come to represent the archetype of the Antichrist, and what can we learn from this connection? First, let's consider the nature of Nero's rule. At the heart of his reign was the desire for absolute power, a power that he believed came from within himself, not from God. Nero didn't just want to rule, he wanted to be worshipped. He declared himself a god, demanded divine honors, and expected people to revere him as if he were above all else. This isn't just a story about a man seeking power. It's the story of a man consumed by pride who believed he was untouchable, above reproach, and above God. And this is where the connection to the Antichrist becomes clear. The Bible describes the Antichrist as a figure who will rise to power in the last days, seeking to be worshipped and exalted above all that is holy. The Antichrist archetype is someone who doesn't just oppose God, but seeks to replace God. Nero's reign, with its demand for worship and adoration, perfectly fits this model. But what makes Nero even more significant in this role is the way he persecuted God's people. In his mind, the Christians were a threat to his power. They refused to worship him, and they wouldn't bow to his authority. So, Nero set out to destroy them. He tortured them, fed them to wild animals, and used them as human torches to light his gardens. His persecution of the Christians wasn't just political, it was spiritual. It was an attempt to stamp out the faith and replace it with his own worship. It's no wonder that many early Christians saw him as the living embodiment of the beast described in Revelation, the Antichrist, who would rise to power and wage war against God's people. But Nero's legacy is not just one of destruction, it's also one of fear. Even after his death, the belief that Nero might return, the Nero Redivivus myth, persisted. For years, people feared that Nero's spirit would rise again, continuing his reign of terror. This myth speaks to the depth of his influence on the Roman world, but it also highlights a truth about evil. Even when it appears defeated, it often lingers, casting a shadow that's hard to escape. But here's the crucial point we need to understand. Nero's power did not last. His empire fell, his reign came to an end, and he was replaced. The myth of his return was ultimately just that, a myth. Evil, no matter how powerful it seems, will never have the final say. God's kingdom is eternal. Nero's legacy as the archetypal Antichrist is a warning for us all. Pride, self-worship, and cruelty have consequences, both in this life and the next. But the ultimate victory belongs to God, and no matter how dark the world may seem, God will have the final say. So, what can we learn from Nero's legacy? First, we must guard against the temptation of pride. It's easy to be swept up in the desire for recognition, to want others to worship us or acknowledge our greatness. But we must remember that true greatness comes from humility, not from elevating ourselves above others. Second, we are reminded that the forces of evil will always seek to destroy what is good. Nero's persecution of the Christians was not just an attack on their bodies, it was an attack on their faith, on their very identity as children of God. And in the same way, the forces of evil in our world will seek to destroy our faith, to make us turn away from God and worship something else. But here's the good news. God is stronger than any force of evil. No matter what comes our way, no matter how strong the temptation or how intense the persecution, God's love and power are greater. And just as He brought victory over Nero's tyranny, He will bring victory over every force of evil that rises against us. Nero may have been the archetype of the Antichrist, but he was not the final word on evil. The final word belongs to Jesus Christ, the true King, the one who has already defeated death and the one who will reign forever. As we come to the end of this journey through Nero's life and his lasting legacy, we're reminded of a powerful truth that runs through history, through Scripture, and through every battle we face today. The battle between good and evil is eternal. Nero may have been one of the most infamous figures in history, embodying the very spirit of evil that the Bible warns us about, but his story is not the final chapter. His reign came to an end, his empire fell, and the terror he spread was replaced by something far greater, the kingdom of God. And that's the message we must hold on to. Evil is temporary, but God's kingdom is eternal. In the book of Revelation, we read about the rise of the Antichrist, a time when the world will be plunged into darkness. But we also know that the ultimate victory belongs to God. Yes, the forces of evil may seem powerful, and yes, there may be times when it feels like evil is winning, but remember, God has already won the victory through Jesus Christ. Nero's reign of terror, his hunger for power, and his demand for worship were all attempts to replace God, but no man, no empire, no power can ever truly take the place of the Almighty. God is the King of kings and the Lord of lords, and His kingdom will never fall. As we look around us today, we can see that the battle between good and evil is still alive. It's not just a battle fought in ancient Rome, it's a battle we face every day. From the temptations we encounter to the struggles we face in our own lives, the forces of evil are constantly trying to pull us away from the light. But we don't have to face this battle alone. Just as the early Christians stood firm in their faith under Nero's persecution, we too can stand firm in the power of God's grace. The victory has already been won. We are more than conquerors through Him who loved us, Romans 8:37. And while we may face challenges, trials, and tribulations, we can take heart knowing that God is with us every step of the way. So, as we reflect on Nero's story, let it serve as a reminder not just of the evil that can rise up in this world, but of the greater power of God that will always overcome it. The victory that we have in Christ is not just for the future, it's for today. No matter what you're facing right now, whether it's personal struggles, fears, or doubts, remember that evil will not have the last word. God's love is stronger, His power is greater, and His kingdom is forever. Let's stand firm in that truth, knowing that we are on the winning side. As we close, I want to encourage you, no matter what darkness may try to rise, keep your eyes fixed on the light of Christ, the one who has already defeated the darkness. His victory is ours. And that is a victory that will last for eternity. So, take heart, be strong, and remember that the battle has already been won. Let's walk in the victory Christ has secured for us, knowing that no matter what the world throws at us, we are more than conquerors through Him who loves us. Thank you for joining me on this journey, and may God bless you with His peace and His strength as you face the battles of life.